Up to this point in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has been on a mission to convince his fellow Israelites that the kingdom of heaven was coming and that they should repent and prepare for this new coming reality. Jesus has had very little interaction with Gentiles. His mission has been almost exclusively Jewish. And you recall that when he sent the disciples out, he told them, go not to the Gentiles or the Samaritans, go instead to the lost sheep, the people of Israel. Now, this doesn't mean that Jesus has not had compassion on Gentiles. You may recall that Jesus has healed the servant of a centurion, and he praised that centurion's faith. But Matthew has portrayed Jesus as having almost a laser-like focus on a mission to the Jews. So what happens when this Jesus meets a very persistent Gentile woman? That's what we're going to explore today on The Way. On this cold, rainy, dreary winter weekend, it's a good time to cozy up to a story. And a story that I believe really truly is the turning point, the hinge upon which the entire Gospel of Matthew swings. Now, it's no accident that the story of the Canaanite woman occurs right after Jesus challenges the purity code and the purity laws of the religious establishment. This woman, as you see, is the embodiment of the other, of someone who is unclean, unholy, unrighteous. She's dangerous. Now, Jesus has just completely challenged all of the grounds for religious stereotyping that the Pharisees might have. He has challenged them and has effectively done away with any distinction that you or I might have to exclude people. So we might expect him to welcome this woman into his presence. After all, this is a chance for him to practice what he preaches, right? And by the way, this is also the very first time in the entire gospel that a woman speaks. Yeah, believe it or not, the first time a woman speaks, the first time a woman's voice is recorded in the gospel, which signifies that this truly is a very significant story to Matthew and to Matthew's community. Now, with all this at stake, when the woman comes to Jesus and pours out her soul and says, please heal my daughter, what do we see in verse 23? But he didn't respond to her at all. Jesus responds with silence. Then his disciples urge him to send her away. Now, we expect the disciples to act that way. They are consistently portrayed as being people who are a little thick, slow to understand what Jesus is trying to teach them. But then in verse 24, Jesus says something that also, again, sounds cold and unfeeling. He says, I've been sent only to the lost sheep, the people of Israel. You see, he is about to exclude this woman. He is withholding God's grace from her. Now, she doesn't give up. She kneels before him and she says, Lord, help me, please help me. And then Jesus says something even worse. This is not going well for Jesus at all. He says, it is not good to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Essentially, Jesus is calling this woman a dog, which was a common racial slur for Gentiles, for Jews to use against Gentiles. Dogs were unclean creatures, and so it's very similar to what the connotations might be if you or I were to call somebody else a dog. Now, there's no getting around this very uncomfortable saying by Jesus. Some scholars have tried to soften Jesus' words in various ways. For example, some have said, this word is not as offensive as it sounds. It has more the meaning of a cute little puppy, not a dog. But that explanation just doesn't work for me. I also don't think Jesus was just testing the woman to see how she would respond. But what is fascinating is how she responds to Jesus. She says to this slur, yes, Lord, but Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall off the master's table. Now, it's a great comeback. She's saying, hey, I'm not asking for all the bread. Please, just heal my daughter. That's all I need. And then, amazingly, Jesus changes his mind. I mean, that fact cannot be overstated, and that is very clear in the text that we have. It's clear in Mark's version of the story as well. Jesus was not going to heal the woman's daughter at first. Something happens in that reply of the woman, and he decides to heal her daughter after all. Now, what happened in this story? Does this contradict what we know about Jesus? Does this contradict what we know about the incarnation? Does it contradict our notions of Jesus' sinlessness, or at least his omniscience, which means to know everything, to know all? Well, let's turn to Dr. Warren Carter from Wright Divinity School for a little more insight into this story.
Yeah, I think it's a really representative story. She's an outsider. She's a Canaanite. She's a woman. There's no reference to any male in the story. And she's got a demon-possessed daughter. I mean, that's about 5 strikes. So it's not a great start. And it's in the area of Tyre and Sidon, where there's bad blood between Jewish folks and Tyre and Sidon. There's a bunch of bad blood there, including some prophetic condemnations of Tyre and Sidon in the Hebrew Bible. So, I mean, this is not all sweetness and light. This is a very conflicted situation. And I think initially Jesus acts out of those sorts of prejudices and those sorts of exclusionary values, and says, no, I don't want anything to do with this. But she perseveres. As one interpreter says, Jesus is caught with his compassion down, which is a wonderful phrase. And she perseveres and calls him basically on his own kind of imperialist Israel tendencies, and says, well, no, even at mealtime, the dogs get the crumbs from the table. It doesn't all stay on the table. It spreads. And she basically one-ups him. She beats him in the verbal exchange. And so we kind of, I mean, the narrative doesn't go inside Jesus and describe any processes, but he does change his whole approach and does heal the daughter. So suddenly she kind of calls him on these prejudices, and my words, he basically says, yeah, you're right, sorry, and heals the daughter.
What do I think happened when Jesus met the Canaanite woman? I believe that for the very first time, Jesus fully understood the ramifications of his mission. And that for the first time, he fully embraced his humanity and his divinity. Jesus really, truly understood that mercy trumps obedience, that compassion trumps purity, that love triumphs over every other quality. See you next time on The Way.